In 2023, the American Psychological Association's Stress in America survey reported that women score statistically higher than men on every major stress indicator measured: financial stress, health stress, discrimination stress, and what the survey termed societal stress, in every single year since the survey's inception in 2007. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics 2022 American Time Use survey found that women perform an average of 2.6 hours of unpaid household labor per day, compared to men's 1.9 hours, a gap that has narrowed by exactly 12 minutes since 1965. The National Alliance on Mental Illness reported in 2023 that women are diagnosed with anxiety disorders at twice the rate of men, and with major depressive disorder at 1.7 times the rate of men. A 2019 study published in JAMA Internal Medicine found that women are 50% more likely than men to be misdiagnosed following a heart attack, a finding that correlates with a separate body of evidence showing women are systematically undertreated for pain in emergency settings. The Pew Research Center reported in 2023 that 58% of mothers in two-parent households say they do more than their fair share of managing the household's mental load, compared to 6% of fathers who say the same. The Families and Work Institute found that women who identify as primary family caregivers report burnout at rates 34% higher than their male counterparts in equivalent employment. The World Health Organization's 2021 Gender and Health data estimates that women globally provide 76% of all unpaid care work. The number has not meaningfully changed in 30 years. The pattern is not new. The collapse is. What the data describes is not a mental health crisis in the clinical sense. It is the predictable output of a specific, sustained, and structurally enforced allocation of labor, emotional, physical, logistical, and relational, that has been assigned to women across generations, across income levels, across marital statuses, and across cultural contexts with a consistency that cannot be explained by individual variation. The phenomenon has several names in the research literature. Sociologist Arlie Hochschild at the University of California, Berkeley named one dimension of it in her 1989 book, The Second Shift, the finding that women who work full-time outside the home return to a second full shift of domestic labor, producing a cumulative annual overwork gap she estimated at 1 extra month of 24-hour days per year compared to male partners. That finding, produced from research conducted in the late 1980s, has been replicated, updated, and confirmed by the American Time Use survey annually since 2003. The gap has narrowed. It has not closed. In 35 years, it has narrowed by 12 minutes per day. A second dimension was named by sociologist Arlie Hochschild in a separate framework, emotional labor, introduced in her 1983 book, The Managed Heart, the work of managing one's own emotional expressions and the emotional states of others as a form of labor that is performed, invisible, and uncompensated. The concept was originally applied to service workers required to perform feeling as part of their job. It migrated into feminist social science as a description of what women do in families, in workplaces, and in social relationships as a matter of structural expectation rather than individual choice. The third dimension, cognitive labor or mental load, was popularized in Gemma Hartley's 2018 book, Fed Up, and prior to that by French cartoonist Emma's 2017 graphic essay, You Should Have Asked, which was shared more than 1 million times within weeks of publication. The mental load is the executive function of the household, the tracking, anticipating, scheduling, delegating, and remembering that keeps domestic life operational. Research by Alison Daminger at Harvard University, published in the American Sociological Review in 2019, found that women perform the majority of the cognitive labor in households, specifically the anticipation and monitoring phases, while men participate more in the decision execution phase. The work of knowing what needs to be done and remembering to do it is distributed along gender lines even in households where partners consider themselves equitable. These 3 forms of labor, domestic, emotional, cognitive, are cumulative. They compound. They do not take vacations. And the women who have been performing all three reliably across careers and families and aging parents and institutional roles for 20 or 30 or 40 years are not experiencing burnout as a psychological event. They are experiencing the arithmetic of an unsustainable allocation finally reaching its limit. The historical parallel is instructive. The post-war economic expansion of the 1950s and 1960s produced a temporary cultural consolidation of the responsible woman archetype, the wife, mother, and household manager whose labor enabled male workforce participation and was simultaneously made invisible by the economic structure that depended on it. Betty Friedan's 1963, The Feminine Mystique, documented the psychological consequences of that arrangement for one demographic slice, educated, white, middle-class women, with a precision that the social science literature has spent the subsequent 60 years extending to the full demographic range of women, the original sample excluded. What Friedan described in 1963 as the problem that has no name has, since then, accumulated a great many names. What it has not accumulated is a solution. The data confirms that the conditions she described have modulated in form while remaining structurally intact. The cultural shorthand for this archetype tends to invoke a specific image. The oldest daughter, the one who managed the household when a parent was absent or struggling, who became the family therapist and scheduler and crisis manager before she was old enough to vote. The research captures that specific formation and extends far beyond it. The oldest daughter phenomenon has received increasing research attention. Lindsay C. Gibson, a clinical psychologist and author of Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, 2015, documented the formation of what she called the parentified child. The child, disproportionately female, who assumes adult emotional and logistical responsibilities in households where a parent is unable or unwilling to provide adequate caregiving. Gibson's clinical observations align with research by Lisa Serbin and colleagues at Concordia University, whose longitudinal studies on childhood role assignment found that girls are socialized into responsibility and caregiving roles earlier and more comprehensively than boys, and that this socialization produces measurable differences in self-monitoring behavior, anxiety sensitivity, and tolerance for others' distress that persist into adulthood. But the data shows the responsible one is not only the parentified oldest daughter. She is also the woman in every workplace who takes the notes, follows up on the action items, remembers the birthdays, organizes the farewell party, and absorbs the interpersonal friction that would otherwise disrupt the team. The office housework problem documented by Joan Williams at the UC Hastings College of the Law, whose research on gender and workplace labor, published in her 2014 book What Works for Women at Work, found that women are asked to perform non-promotable tasks at higher rates than men, comply with those requests at higher rates, and are penalized in evaluation when they decline. She is the woman in a romantic partnership who tracks the pediatrician appointments and the permission slips, and the fact that the car needs an oil change and that her mother-in-law's birthday is in 2 weeks. She is the woman in the sandwich generation, 55% of whom, according to Pew Research Center 2022 data, are women, simultaneously managing dependent children and aging parents while maintaining employment. She is the woman in every community organization who keeps showing up because she knows if she doesn't, things will not get done, and she cannot tolerate things not getting done because she learned at an early age that her value was conditional on her usefulness. That last clause is the psychological core of the pattern, and the research on it is specific. Subscribe if this kind of research-grounded analysis belongs in your feed. This channel covers the structural and psychological data that usually gets softened before it reaches public discourse. The behavioral profile of the woman running on empty at 45 or 55 or 65 was assembled over decades through a process that developmental psychologists have documented with increasing specificity. Carol Gilligan at New York University, whose 1982 book In a Different Voice challenged Lawrence Kohlberg's male-centered developmental model, documented that girls are socialized into what she called an ethic of care. a moral framework organized around relationships, responsibilities, and the avoidance of harm to others. At a developmental stage, when boys are being socialized into an ethic of justice, organized around individual rights and rules. Gilligan's framework has been critiqued and refined in the decades since, but its core empirical observation, that girls learn to organize their self-concept around their responsiveness to others, has been replicated consistently across developmental research. The mechanism by which this happens is specific. Research by Judith Chu at Stanford University, whose work on boys' emotional development and gendered socialization has been published in multiple peer-reviewed journals, and parallel research by Lynn Mickle-Brown and Carol Gilligan, documented in their 1992 book Meeting at the Crossroads, identified the phenomenon of loss of voice in adolescent girls, the measurable suppression of self-assertion, disagreement, and direct expression of needs that occurs between ages 8 and 12 in girls as they encounter and begin to internalize the social expectation that likability and goodness require accommodation. The girl who says directly what she wants and refuses what she doesn't want is described with words that would not be applied to a boy making identical choices. The girl internalizes the feedback. She learns. The learning is thorough and early. What emerges from this formation is not weakness. It is a highly functional, highly competent adult who has developed exceptional capacity for anticipating others' needs, managing complex relational systems, tolerating personal discomfort in service of group stability, and maintaining performance under sustained stress. These are genuine competencies. They are also, when they have been operating at full capacity for 3 or 4 decades, without adequate replenishment, a structure that eventually reaches its physiological and psychological limits. Psychologist Christina Maslach at the University of California, Berkeley, whose foundational research on burnout has been the field's primary framework since her 1982 book Burnout. The Cost of Caring and the development of the Maslach Burnout Inventory with Susan Jackson identified 3 components of burnout: emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and reduced personal accomplishment. Maslach's later research, particularly her 2003 paper, Job Burnout, New Directions in Research and Intervention, in Current Directions in Psychological Science, found that burnout is not primarily a function of individual psychological fragility. It is a function of the chronic mismatch between the demands placed on an individual and the resources provided to meet those demands. The individual is not the variable. The allocation is. For women who have been the responsible one across multiple overlapping domains simultaneously, family, workplace, extended family, community, the mismatch between demand and resource has been structural and sustained. The burnout the data documents in this population is not a psychological event. It is a structural output. It is what Maslach's model predicts will happen when high demand, low resource conditions are maintained across a sufficient time horizon. The psychological literature on this population is extensive. The physiological literature is less cited but equally specific, and it points toward consequences that extend well beyond mood and motivation. Alyssa Appel at the University of California, San Francisco, whose research on stress, telomere biology, and cellular aging has been published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and multiple other peer-reviewed journals, found in her landmark 2004 paper with Elizabeth Blackburn and colleagues that chronic psychological stress is associated with significantly shortened telomere length, a biomarker of cellular aging, and with reduced telomerase activity, the enzyme that maintains telomere length. The magnitude of the effect in their sample of caregiving mothers was equivalent to approximately 10 years of additional biological aging compared to low-stress controls. Appel's subsequent research has consistently found that women in high allostatic load caregiving roles show accelerated cellular aging markers at rates that are both statistically significant and clinically meaningful. The allostatic load framework, the cumulative physiological cost of chronic stress activation, developed in the research of Bruce McEwen at Rockefeller University, maps directly onto the life histories of the responsible one population. Allostatic load is not acute stress. It is the cost of sustained, repeated stress response activation without adequate recovery periods. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the system that regulates cortisol production and the fight or flight response, is designed for episodic activation and return to baseline. When the activation is chronic, when the demands on the system never fully resolve, when there is always another thing that needs to be done, another person who needs to be managed, another crisis that requires absorption, the axis itself is gradually recalibrated toward a state of sustained low-grade activation. The health consequences of this recalibration are documented and specific. Research by Nadine Burke-Harris, former Surgeon General of California and founder of the Center for Youth Wellness, drawing on the adverse childhood experiences literature and extending it through her own clinical research, showed that chronic stress activation, particularly when it begins in childhood in the form of parentification and excessive responsibility assignment, is associated with increased rates of cardiovascular disease, autoimmune disorders, metabolic syndrome, and immune dysregulation in adulthood. The woman who was the responsible one at age 8 has a different physiological history than the woman who was not. That history is written in her biology. This is not a finding that invites sentimentality. It is a finding with specific clinical implications that the healthcare system has been slow to integrate, in part because women's stress-related symptoms have historically been undertreated and misdiagnosed, as the JAMA Internal Medicine Cardiac Misdiagnosis data cited in the opening sequence confirms. This channel publishes one video per week on the structural and psychological research that shapes how people actually live. Subscribe to stay in the data. The responsible one maintains, at a level often below conscious awareness, a comprehensive accounting of what she has given and what has not been reciprocated. The research on this internal accounting is specific, and the findings are not what the popular framing of women's resentment tends to suggest. Sociologist Arlie Hochschild's research on the economy of gratitude in domestic partnerships, developed in the second shift and extended in subsequent work, found that the emotional significance of labor is not primarily determined by the quantity of work performed, but by whether that work is seen, named, and acknowledged. Women in her study who performed the majority of domestic labor reported significantly higher rates of resentment when that labor was invisible, when it was assumed rather than noticed, than when it was acknowledged even without being redistributed. The acknowledgement does not close the gap. The invisibility compounds it. Research by Stephanie Kuntz at the Evergreen State College, whose historical analysis of American marriage and family structure across multiple books including Marriage, A History, 2005, documented that the expectation of women's invisible labor is not a natural feature of domestic organization. It is a historically specific arrangement that was codified in law and economics in the 19th century, reinforced by the post-war domestic ideology of the 1950s, and has persisted through the feminist movement's partial renegotiation of public sphere access while remaining substantially unreformed in the private sphere. Women gained access to the workplace. The workplace did not gain corresponding male participation in domestic labor. The result was addition, not redistribution. The psychological consequence of sustained invisible labor is not primarily resentment, though resentment is a symptom. The primary consequence is what researchers call self-silencing, the progressive suppression of one's own needs, preferences, and limits in service of maintaining relational stability and meeting others' expectations. Dana Jack at Western Washington University, whose research on self-silencing in women was published in her 1991 book, Silencing the Self, and extended across multiple subsequent papers, found that high self-silencing scores in women are strongly correlated with depression, relationship dissatisfaction, and a specific form of identity erosion she described as the gradual replacement of an authentic self-concept with a performed self-concept organized entirely around others' needs. The woman running on empty at 55 has, in many cases, been performing a version of herself for so long that the question of what she actually wants, absent the wants of the people she is responsible for, has become genuinely difficult to answer. Not rhetorically difficult, neurologically difficult. The neural pathways associated with self-directed preference and desire have been underactivated relative to the pathways associated with other-directed monitoring and response. The research on self-silencing suggests that recovery requires not just rest, but reactivation. The deliberate, sustained practice of identifying and acting on one's own preferences in ways that have been systematically deprioritized for decades. The pattern the data documents is not a gradual fade. It tends to have a specific precipitating structure, and the research on the timing of women's burnout collapse identifies consistent triggers. A 2021 report from McKinsey & Company and Lean Org's Women in the Workplace study, which surveyed more than 65,000 employees across 423 companies, found that women in senior roles reported higher burnout rates than men in equivalent roles for the third consecutive year of the survey, and that the gap was widest in the 40 to 54 age cohort. The precipitating factor most consistently associated with reported burnout in this group was not workload volume per se, but what the researchers called unsupported demand. High demands paired with insufficient organizational support, insufficient recognition, and the requirement to manage others' emotional needs as part of the work itself. The timing, predominantly ages 40 to 55, is not accidental. It corresponds to the peak of what researchers call the sandwich generation period. The years when dependent children are most resource-intensive, aging parents are beginning to require active caregiving, career demands are often at their highest, and the woman has been operating at full capacity for long enough that the cumulative allostatic load is approaching its biological limits. The collapse does not happen when things are hardest. It happens when things have been hard for long enough. The specific form the collapse takes varies, but the research identifies consistent presentations. A 2019 paper by Ravi Shankar Bhatt and colleagues published in the Indian Journal of Psychiatry reviewing global burnout data found that women's burnout more frequently presents as what clinicians call smiling depression, a maintained external presentation of competence and functionality alongside an internal state of profound depletion, hopelessness, and emotional numbness. The maintained external presentation is itself a feature of the responsible one's formation. She has been performing competence under duress since childhood. The performance continues even when the performer is dissolving. This presentation pattern has specific clinical implications. Women presenting with smiling depression are systematically underdiagnosed. They do not look like the cultural image of depression. They continue to function, and they have often been trained so thoroughly to minimize their own distress that their self-reports to clinicians understate the severity of their condition. The misdiagnosis and undertreatment data for women in mental health settings parallels the misdiagnosis data in physical health settings. The pattern is the same. The woman presents as more functional than she is. The system responds to what is presented. The internal condition goes unaddressed. The moment at which a woman recognizes that she is running on empty, that the competence and the reliability and the showing up have been sustained at a cost she can no longer conceal from herself, is documented in the clinical and qualitative research with enough consistency to describe its structure. Kristen Neff at the University of Texas at Austin, whose research on self-compassion has been published across multiple papers in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and consolidated in her 2011 book Self-Compassion, found that women score significantly lower than men on measures of self-compassion, defined specifically as the ability to treat oneself with the same kindness and understanding one would offer a friend facing a difficult situation. The gender gap in self-compassion scores is robust across cultural contexts and age groups. Neff's research identified the mechanism. Women are more likely than men to respond to their own suffering with self-criticism, to view their struggles as evidence of personal inadequacy, and to respond to failure by doubling down on performance rather than allowing recovery. This finding lands with specific weight in the context of the responsible one, because the moment of recognition, the moment of running on empty, frequently triggers not relief, not a lowering of demands, but a spiral of self-recrimination in which the woman interrogates her own inadequacy for not being able to sustain what she has sustained. She is not failing a reasonable demand. She is failing a structurally unreasonable one. The self-criticism does not make that distinction. The clinical literature on this post-recognition period, drawing on Maslach's burnout research and the self-compassion literature, identifies a consistent set of immediate behavioral responses, most of which the data shows are counterproductive to recovery. The first and most common response is the attempt to restore function through the same mechanisms that produce the depletion: increasing efficiency, reducing sleep, cutting the remaining personal activities, exercise, social connection, creative pursuits, that feel like luxuries the current situation cannot afford. The logic is that more discipline will close the gap. The physiology is that discipline requires the prefrontal cortex resources that sustained stress most directly depletes. The woman who is running on empty in precisely the cognitive system that would generate the disciplined solutions she is reaching for. The research described in this script was not produced by a single study or a single researcher. It accumulated across sociology, developmental psychology, clinical psychology, endocrinology, and cellular biology across 6 decades from researchers at major research universities, published in peer-reviewed journals. The picture it assembles is consistent, specific, and comprehensive. It describes, in granular and replicable detail, the mechanism by which a structural allocation of labor produces measurable harm to a specific population over a specific timeline. The question of what was done with that research, at the policy level, at the institutional level, at the level of how households and workplaces and healthcare systems are organized, is a separate question. And the answer to it is in the data already cited. The gap in unpaid labor narrowed by 12 minutes per day in 35 years. The burnout rate gap is widening. The misdiagnosis rate is unchanged. That observation will appear once in this script. Moving on. The recovery literature for this population is less developed than the literature on the problem, which is itself a data point. What the research does show is specific and does not always conform to the cultural narratives available about women's restoration. The retreat, the self-care weekend, the boundary-setting workshop. Emily Nagoski and Amelia Nagoski's 2019 book Burnout: The Secret to Unlocking the Stress Cycle, drawing on Nagoski's research background in health psychology and the burnout literature, identifies what they call completing the stress cycle, the physiological necessity of allowing the stress response to run its full arc to completion, rather than managing the stressor while leaving the biological stress response in a state of chronic partial activation. Their central argument, grounded in the stress biology research of Appel, McEwen, and others, is that addressing the source of stress, the stressor, and completing the stress response, the cycle, are two separate biological requirements. The woman who removes a stressor but does not allow the physiological stress response to complete through movement, social connection, creative expression, or sustained rest remains in a state of biological activation regardless of the changed external circumstances. The body does not know the stressor is gone. The body knows only whether the response has completed. This distinction is not intuitive. It is physiologically specific, and it explains why women who take vacations, reduce obligations, and make structural changes to their lives frequently report not feeling better immediately or feeling worse before feeling better, in ways that can be misread as evidence that nothing helps. What is actually occurring is that the stress cycle, which has been interrupted and suppressed for years, is completing. The depletion that becomes visible in recovery is not created by recovery. It was there already, held in suspension by the performance of competence. Recovery makes it legible, not larger. The research on social connection as a stress response regulator is specific and underemphasized in popular recovery discourse. Shelley Taylor at UCLA, whose research on the Tenden-Befriend response published in her 2000 paper in Psychological Review, identified that women's stress response is not primarily organized around fight or flight, but around affiliation, the activation of the oxytocin-mediated system that drives social connection as a stress management mechanism. found that social support functions as a direct physiological regulator of the stress response in ways that solitary rest does not. The responsible one who has spent decades giving social support to others and systematically underinvesting in her own social support networks has depleted the primary mechanism by which her own stress response is regulated. The clinical implication is specific. Recovery for this population is not primarily a matter of doing less. It is a matter of restoring the specific biological systems, social connection, physiological stress cycle completion, self-directed behavior, that the structural allocation of responsibility has most directly suppressed. The intervention is not simplification. It is reactivation. If the research in this video is new to you, it shouldn't be. Subscribe. This channel covers what the peer-reviewed literature actually says, not what the wellness industry has turned it into. The McKinsey and Lean-In data on corporate burnout is widely cited. The structural analysis of why the data looks the way it does is less frequently the subject of organizational intervention. The double bind for women in professional settings, documented most precisely by Alice Eagley at Northwestern University and Linda Carley at Wellesley College in their 2007 book, Through the Glass Labyrinth, is the empirically demonstrated finding that women in leadership roles are evaluated negatively when they display the directive, authoritative behaviors associated with competence in leadership, because those behaviors conflict with the communal, accommodating behaviors associated with femininity. Simultaneously, women who adopt communal behaviors in leadership settings are evaluated as warm but not competent. The bind is structural. The behaviors that generate professional advancement generate social penalty, and the behaviors that avoid social penalty generate professional stagnation. The woman who survives this environment does so by developing an extraordinarily sophisticated behavioral code, presenting authority as collaboration, ambition as service, assertiveness as facilitation, that is functionally exhausting to maintain across a full career. Research by Tomas Chamorro-Premuzic at University College London, whose work on gender, leadership, and personality has been published across multiple journals and consolidated in his 2019 book, Why Do So Many Incompetent Men Become Leaders?, found that the psychological traits associated with successful long-term leadership, emotional stability, empathy, self-awareness, collaborative orientation, are more common in women than in men in population distributions, but that the selection and promotion processes in most organizations continue to preferentially select for the traits associated with short-term dominance and confidence rather than long-term effectiveness. The implication is not that women are better leaders. It is that the selection process is misaligned with the performance evidence, and that women who are effective leaders are bearing the additional cost of performing leadership in a system that does not recognize the form of leadership they are actually providing. The double bind does not end at retirement or career exit. The woman who leaves the workforce to care for family members, still overwhelmingly women, by the BLS data, and who re-enters later finds a skills and compensation penalty that the Institute for Women's Policy Research, in their 2020 report on workforce reentry, estimated at 18 to 37% of prior wage levels depending on the duration of absence. The responsible one who left to manage a family crisis returns to a market that has precisely priced her absence from it. The labor she performed during that absence, the caregiving, the household management, the emotional and logistical infrastructure work, does not appear on a resume. It does not translate into Social Security credits at a rate that reflects its economic value. It disappears from the official accounting. The responsible one, archetype as it circulates in popular culture, tends to invoke a middle-class white woman formation, the overwhelmed suburban mother, the burned-out professional. The research data is unambiguous that the phenomenon is neither race-specific nor class-specific, and that the populations for whom the burden is most severe are largely absent from the dominant cultural narrative about it. Sociologist Patricia Hill Collins at the University of Maryland, whose foundational work on Black feminist thought and intersectionality, particularly her 1990 book Black Feminist Thought, Knowledge, Consciousness, and the Politics of Empowerment documented the specific construction of the strong Black woman archetype in African American cultural context. The expectation of emotional stoicism, self-sufficiency, and community responsibility that has been both a source of genuine resilience and a mechanism by which Black women's needs for support and care are systematically denied by external systems and through internalization by themselves. The psychological literature on this archetype, sometimes called the Superwoman schema, was formalized by Cheryl Woods-Giscombe at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, whose qualitative and quantitative research, published in multiple journals, including the Journal of Transcultural Nursing and Qualitative Health Research, identified the Superwoman schema as a distinct construct associated with elevated allostatic load, delayed healthcare seeking, and suppressed emotional expression in African American women. The data on healthcare outcomes for Black women in the United States is the most concentrated evidence of what sustained high-demand, low-support conditions produce over time. The Centers for Disease Control reported in 2022 that Black women die from pregnancy-related complications at 2.6 times the rate of white women, a disparity that persists after controlling for income and education. The research of Arline Jeronimus at the University of Michigan, whose concept of weathering, the premature physiological aging produced by sustained exposure to social and economic adversity, has been published in American Journal of Public Health and multiple other journals, shows that African American women show biological aging markers equivalent to those of white women who are 7.5 years older. This is allostatic load made visible in the body at a population level. For low-income women of all racial backgrounds, the responsible one structure operates without the buffering resources, domestic help, therapy, flexible employment, the option of reducing hours, that middle-class analyses of burnout take for granted. The woman working 2 jobs while managing childcare and elder care does not have access to the recovery interventions the popular burnout literature prescribes. The research and the prescriptions are frequently produced for and distributed to a population that is not the one most severely affected. The research on relationship dynamics in burned-out women who have been the primary responsible party in their partnerships and families is specific, and it describes a pattern that has been building in the data for more than 2 decades. The American Psychological Association's divorce data and the academic research on divorce initiation shows consistently that women initiate approximately 70% of divorces in heterosexual marriages. Research by Michael Rosenfeld at Stanford University, published in the American Sociological Review in 2018, found that this disparity has increased over time and is most concentrated in women over 40. The finding is not primarily a reflection of men's behavior. It is a reflection of the accumulating cost accounting described above, the invisible labor, the self-silencing, the unacknowledged cognitive load, reaching a threshold at which the responsible one stops maintaining the relationship's infrastructure and instead stops maintaining the relationship. The same pattern appears in friendships. Research on women's social networks across adulthood shows a consistent pattern of contraction during the high-demand years of early childrearing and peak career investment, followed by a failure to reconstitute those networks in the burnout years. A 2023 American Perspectives survey by the Survey Center on American Life found that women's close friendship rates have declined significantly since 1990, with the sharpest declines in the 40 to 55 cohort. The responsible one who maintained everyone else's relational needs during the high-demand years often arrives at the collapse point having underinvested in the social connections that would constitute her primary recovery resource. The family dynamics are more complex and less studied. The adult children of the responsible one, who grew up in households where one parent absorbed the emotional and logistical labor without apparent cost, carry their own formation into their adult lives and their own adult relationships. The research on parentification and role modeling of emotional labor in children is consistent. Children who observe one parent performing all the invisible labor and the other parent consuming it without recognition are receiving specific instruction about how domestic arrangements work. The intergenerational transmission of this pattern is documented. It is one of the mechanisms by which a structural allocation persists across generations, even as the cultural framing around it changes. The research on what would structurally address the conditions producing this population's exhaustion exists. It is specific and empirically supported. Its relationship to actual policy is approximately what the 12 minutes in 35 years data suggests. Paid family and medical leave, available in 178 countries according to the International Labor Organization's 2022 data, is not federally mandated in the United States. The FMLA of 1993 provides unpaid leave for qualifying workers at qualifying employers, a protection that, per the Department of Labor, covers approximately 56% of the workforce and is used primarily by women. The countries with the most comprehensive paid leave policies, Iceland, Sweden, Norway, show the smallest gender gaps in domestic labor in the OECD data. The correlation is consistent across multiple comparative analyses. Universal childcare, present in varying forms in France, Canada, Germany, and the Nordic countries, would structurally reduce the caregiving burden most heavily concentrated in women in the current American system. The Center for American Progress estimated in 2020 that the absence of affordable childcare costs the U.S. economy approximately $57 billion annually in lost earnings, productivity, and tax revenue. That number reflects only the economic dimension of a cost, the research shows, is also being paid in the physiological and psychological health of the women absorbing it. The public discourse on burnout in this population, when it reaches the policy level, tends to resolve into individual prescriptions, therapy, mindfulness, better boundaries, rather than structural interventions. This is not an accident of emphasis. Individual-level prescriptions leave the structural allocation intact. They address the symptoms while preserving the conditions. The aggregate of the evidence points toward a population that has been performing a structural function. The reproduction, maintenance, and emotional regulation of family, workplace, and community life. That is essential to how those systems operate. That is systematically invisible in the accounting of those systems. And that has been sustained for long enough, in enough women across enough contexts, that the physiological and psychological consequences are now measurable at the population level in burnout rates, in divorce initiation data, in allostatic load markers, in telomere length studies, in cardiac misdiagnosis rates. What remains genuinely unknown is the trajectory. The McKinsey and Lean-In data shows that the burnout gap between women and men in corporate environments is not narrowing. It is widening, year over year, for the third consecutive year of measurement. The domestic labor gap narrowed by 12 minutes per day in 35 years. The Superwoman schema data shows that the populations most severely affected are those for whom the mainstream burnout conversation has been least relevant and least accessible. The intergenerational transmission research suggests that the formation producing the responsible one is replicating into the next generation without structural intervention. The one finding the data consistently points toward as the most consequential variable, the factor most predictive of different outcomes at the individual, relational, and institutional level, is recognition, not recovery, not restoration. Recognition, the acknowledgement, specific and named, of the labor that has been performed by the systems and relationships and institutions that have depended on it. Hochschild's economy of gratitude data established decades ago that invisibility compounds harm. The research since has confirmed and extended that finding in every domain it has examined. The responsible one has been managing the systems around her for long enough that the systems have stopped noticing she is managing them. That is not a description of something sustainable. The data already knows how this ends. The open question is whether the recognition that the research shows matters will arrive before or after it does.